In the winter of 1825, the Russian Empire trembled. A rebellion had broken out in St. Petersburg, led by liberal reformers demanding that the nation modernize, that its archaic structures catch up with the progress of Western Europe. The rebellion, later known as the Decembrist Uprising, was brutally crushed by the new Tsar, Nicholas I. One of its most prominent leaders, a brilliant poet and liberal thinker named Kondraty Ryleyev, was sentenced to death. On the day of the execution, Ryleyev stood upon the gallows. The noose was placed securely around his neck. The crowd held its breath as the trapdoor opened, but as Ryleyev dangled, the rope snapped, dashing him violently to the frozen ground. In those days, such an event was considered a sign of providence, a manifestation of divine will. According to centuries of tradition, a man saved from execution by a broken rope was almost always pardoned. Bruised, dirtied, but believing his life had just been spared, Ryleyev stood up. If he had remained silent, if he had simply bowed his head and let the custom of the era run its course, he would have walked away a free man. But the human tongue is a wild, untamed beast. It strains constantly to break out of its cage, and if it is not ruthlessly managed, it will run wild and cause your absolute ruin. Ryleyev looked at the crowd. He looked at the Tsar's executioners, and in a moment of arrogant, unrestrained emotion, he shouted, "You see, in Russia they don't know how to do anything properly, not even how to make a rope." A messenger was immediately dispatched to the Tsar to report the broken rope and the custom of pardon. When Nicholas I heard the news, he was prepared to sign the pardon. But first he asked, "Did Ryleyev say anything after his fall?" The messenger replied, "Sire, he said that in Russia, we do not even know how to make a decent rope." The Tsar paused, closed the pardon, and replied, "In that case, let us prove him wrong." The next day, Ryleyev was walked back to the gallows. This time, the rope did not break. Once your words are out in the world, you cannot take them back. They are no longer under your control. The momentary gratification you gain from your biting sarcasm, your clever remarks, and your desperate bids for attention is always outweighed by the immense price you will ultimately pay. In a world that cannot stop shouting, silence is not merely a choice. It is your greatest strategic weapon. To understand why saying less is an absolute requirement for power, we must look back thousands of years before the Russian gallows, to the battlefields of ancient Rome. Gnaeus Marcius, known as Coriolanus, was Rome's greatest military hero. In the first half of the 5th century BC, he won legendary victories, saving the city from total desolation, time and time again. Because he spent his entire life on the battlefield, the common citizens of Rome did not know him personally. To them, he was a mythical giant, an untouchable symbol of strength and protection. In 491 BC, Coriolanus decided to enter politics. He ran for the high office of consul. When the day of the election arrived, Coriolanus made his entry into the forum. But instead of presenting himself with humility, he entered escorted by the entire Senate and the wealthy patrician aristocracy. This blustering show of unearned confidence deeply disturbed the common people. But the real disaster began when Coriolanus spoke. Instead of addressing the common folk with respect, he spoke only to the wealthy elite who surrounded him. His words were arrogant, dismissive, and insolent. He bragged endlessly of his battlefield exploits, made sour jokes that only appealed to the upper class, voiced angry accusations against his political rivals, and speculated on how much wealth his victories would bring to Rome. He spoke at length because his ego demanded validation. He wanted the crowd to know exactly how intelligent, how brave, and how superior he was. But as the crowd listened, they realized that this legendary warrior was nothing more than a common, insecure braggart. The mystery was gone. The awe they had felt for him evaporated in the heat of his endless words. They saw his weaknesses, his pride, and his volatile temper. When the polling day arrived, the common people turned out in massive numbers to ensure he was not elected. Defeated and bitter, Coriolanus returned to the battlefield, vowing revenge. Weeks later, a large shipment of grain arrived in Rome during a severe famine. The Senate was prepared to distribute this food to the starving citizens for free. But Coriolanus appeared on the Senate floor, consumed by anger, and took the stand. Had he kept his mouth shut, had he remained silent, his reputation as a great general would have stayed intact. But once again, he could not control his tongue. He argued passionately against distributing the grain. He condemned the very concept of democracy, advocated for getting rid of the people's representatives, the tribunes, and called for turning the entire government over to the patricians. His angry tirade spread like wildfire through the streets of Rome. The people were so incensed by his insolence that a riot broke out. The tribunes demanded his arrest, and Coriolanus was permanently banished from Rome. The city's greatest hero died in exile, hated and forgotten by the nation he had spent his life defending. If Coriolanus had said less, the citizens of Rome would never have had a reason to be offended by him. They would have maintained their powerful awe of his battlefield achievements. He would have easily been elected consul, and he would have quietly accomplished every single one of his political goals. But he squandered his treasure of words. He opened his mouth too wide, and in doing so, put his ender fate into the hands of his despisers. The Renaissance genius Leonardo da Vinci once wrote, "Oysters open completely when the moon is full, and when the crab sees one, it throws a piece of stone or seaweed into it, and the oyster cannot close again, so that it serves the crab for meat. Such is the fate of him who opens his mouth too much, and thereby puts himself at the mercy of the listener." When you speak endlessly, you are the open oyster, and the predatory crabs around you are simply waiting for the perfect moment to throw a stone into your gears. Now contrast the self-destruction of Coriolanus with the absolute untouchable authority of the longest reigning monarch in European history, King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. The court of Versailles was a giant scheming arena of power. Nobles, ministers, and courtiers spent their days and nights debating issues of state, forming secret alliances, and plotting against one another. Every courtier was desperate to win the king's favor, to discover his preferences, and to find a way to manipulate his decisions. Whenever a major decision had to be made, the court would choose two representatives to present the opposing arguments directly to Louis. The preparation for these audiences was excruciating. Courtiers would argue for days. What specific words would appeal to the king? What would annoy him? What expression should they have on their faces? Finally, the fateful moment would arrive. The two representatives would be granted an audience with the king. They would speak at length, spelling out the options in detail, pleading their cases with passion and eloquence, desperately trying to read the king's reaction. Louis XIV would sit before them in absolute, terrifying silence. His face was a perfect, unreadable mask. Not a single muscle twitched. His eyes did not betray a hint of agreement, anger, or interest. He listened quietly, soaking in every word, every gesture, and every slip of the tongue. When they finally finished speaking, exhausted and sweating from the tension, they would look to him, pleading for his judgment. Louis would look at them calmly, stand up, and utter just 3 words. "I shall see." Then he would walk away. The ministers would never hear another word from the king on that subject. They would simply witness the result weeks later, when Louis would announce his decision and execute it with ruthless speed. He never consulted them again, and he never explained his reasons. Louis XIV was not born taciturn. As a young man, he was known for talking at length, delighting in his own eloquence and wit. But as he grew in power, he realized a profound truth. A king who speaks too much ceases to be a king. He becomes common. His later silence was a calculated, self-imposed mask. By saying less than necessary, Louis kept everyone below him, in a state of continuous suspended terror. No one knew exactly where he stood, and no one could predict his reactions. Because his courtiers had no idea what he wanted to hear, they could not flatter him or deceive him with tailored lies. As they talked on and on to fill the heavy silence, they nervously revealed their own hidden agendas, their personal biases, and their deep-seated weaknesses. Louis simply gathered this intelligence and used it against them to maintain his absolute grip on the state. As the French courtier Saint-Simon wrote, "No one knew as well as he how to sell his words, his smile, even his glances. Everything in him was valuable, because he created differences, and his majesty was enhanced by the sparseness of his words. In a loud room, the man who controls his tongue immediately becomes the most powerful presence. Your silence makes other human beings deeply uncomfortable. Humans are machines of interpretation. They have an insatiable, desperate need to explain everything. When you withhold your words, you deny them that explanation. You create a psychological vacuum. And in their anxiety to fill that vacuum, they will jump in, nervously babbling, revealing valuable secrets, and handing you the ultimate strategic advantage. Why does saying less than necessary produce such a powerful, almost hypnotic effect on human behavior? The answer lies in the cognitive matrix of interpersonal power. Power is, in many ways, a game of appearances. When you try to impress people with your words, the more you say, the more common you appear, and the less in control. Even if you are saying something completely ordinary, it will seem profound, original, and sphinx-like if you make it vague, open-ended, and brief. When you carefully control what you reveal, others cannot pierce your intentions or find your weaknesses. The artist Andy Warhol discovered this exact phenomenon early in his career. He realized that it was generally impossible to get people to do what you wanted them to do by talking to them and trying to convince them. The moment you argue, you invite resistance. Humans naturally resist out of sheer perversity. Instead, Warhol adopted a strategy of extreme brevity. In interviews, he would give short, enigmatic answers, often replying with a simple yes or no, or I don't know. He let others do all the talking. As a result, the public and the media became obsessed with interpreting his brief comments. They spent endless hours analyzing his work, projecting their own deep meanings onto his simple statements. By saying less, Warhol created an aura of genius and mystery that made his art immensely valuable. He realized that the less you say, the more others are forced to think about you. Furthermore, saying less drastically reduces the risk of saying something foolish or dangerous. The tongue is a direct line to your ego. When you are caught in the heat of a social interaction, your ego desperately wants to be flattered. It wants to show off its intelligence, its taste, and its superiority. This is why people blurt out their plans, reveal their secrets, and make biting, sarcastic remarks just to get a quick laugh. But once those words leave your lips, you can never claw them back. The politician Cardinal de Retz warned, "It is even more damaging for a minister to say foolish things than to do them." Your actions can often be corrected, reframed, or covered up, but a foolish, arrogant, or undutiful statement sticks in the human mind like a poisoned arrow. The Elizabethan courtier, Sir Walter Raleigh, observed that undutiful words of a subject do often take deeper root than the memory of ill deeds. He learned this lesson the hard way. A single careless, sarcastic remark about Queen Elizabeth's aging appearance cost him his head, despite his years of loyal service to the crown. When you master the Stoic discipline of silence, you are no longer at the mercy of your momentary impulses. You allow your intellect to filter your words, ensuring that what you say is calculated, purposeful, and controlled. But let us be realistic. Silence is a weapon, and, like any weapon, it must be used with precise calculation. If you are always silent, if you never speak, you will eventually arouse deep suspicion. People will view your absolute silence as cold, defensive, and arrogant. Your superiors may feel insecure around you, wondering what you are hiding. Your peers will stop trusting you because you seem like a calculating machine. To prevent this, you must understand the reversal of the rule, the strategic use of the verbal smokescreen. There are times when it is highly unwise to be silent. In those moments, your greatest weapon is not quietness, but the illusion of openness. By bending your listener's ear with endless, harmless talk, you can completely distract and mesmerize them. The trick is simple. Hide your true intentions not by closing up, but by talking endlessly about your desires, your goals, and your opinions. Just not your real ones. The verbose are rarely perceived as sly, calculating, or manipulative. Instead, society views talkative, expressive people as harmless, unsophisticated, and helpless. By talking more and making yourself appear weaker, simpler, and less intelligent than your mark, you can practice deep deception with absolute ease. This was the preferred tactic of the legendary con artist, Count Victor Lustig. Lustig was once preparing to sell the Eiffel Tower to an unsuspecting French scrap metal dealer. The deal was an elaborate scam, but at the last minute the buyer became highly suspicious. He sensed that something was off, and his guard went up. When they met to finalize the transaction, Lustig immediately read his target's defensiveness. Instead of going on the defensive himself, or retreating into quiet calculation, Lustig leaned across the table and began to speak in a low, confidential whisper. He did not talk about the value of the scrap iron. Instead, he began to complain about his low salary as a government official, his difficult personal finances, his wife's expensive tastes, and how incredibly unappreciated he felt in his job. Lustig made himself seem weak, vulnerable, and slightly corrupt. To the scrap metal dealer, this endless, pathetic babbling was the ultimate proof of honesty. He realized that Lustig was simply asking for a bribe. He relaxed, handed over the money, and walked straight into the trap. Lustig used false sincerity as a powerful decoy. He spoke endlessly about meaningless personal struggles to make himself seem open and familiar, while his real devious intentions remained completely buried beneath the noise. Use your words as a curtain of smoke. When you are in the presence of those who are suspicious or insecure, do not shut down. Play the role of the court jester. Talk, entertain, and share irrelevant personal details. Let them believe they have sounded your depth. Let them feel superior to you. And while their eyes are trained on the colorful decoy you are dangling in front of them, you can quietly and invisibly orchestrate your victory from the shadows. The ancient Chinese philosopher Han Fei Tzu once gave this advice to sovereigns. Never start moving your own lips and teeth before the subordinates do. The longer I keep quiet, the sooner others move their lips and teeth. As they move their lips and teeth, I can thereby understand their real intentions. Whether you are navigating a toxic corporate hierarchy, managing a high-stakes business negotiation, or simply defending your personal boundaries against manipulative peers, the rule remains absolute. He who controls his tongue controls the room. When you say less than necessary, you create an unreadable, untouchable persona. You force your competitors to exhaust their energy trying to explain you. You protect your vulnerabilities, you hide your triggers, and you keep your plans completely shielded from sabotage. Stop wasting your precious words on those who do not deserve them. Stop trying to prove your intelligence, your wealth, or your status to people who are simply waiting to use your ego against you. Place your iron hand inside a velvet glove. Master the discipline of weaponized silence. Let the loud world scream, fight, and exhaust itself for attention. For your part, stand back. Observe, say less than necessary, and win the war in silence.